Turn off your fridge right now. Mentally, just imagine it. Everything inside spoils in days. Now imagine that's just life. Every single day for hundreds of thousands of years. No ice, no cans, no vacuum seal. Now picture a hunter dragging a mammoth carcass back to camp. 3 million calories of meat. Way more than anyone can eat before it turns. In a few days, without something clever, all of that food, all of that survival is just going to rot in the sun. And here's the part that should stop you. Right now, in your fridge, in your pantry, in your freezer, is more preserved food than most ancient humans saw in an entire season. And yet somehow, without electricity, without plastic, without a single expiration date, they kept meat edible for months, sometimes years. There's a hole in the ground in Siberia over 9,000 years old. Inside it, archaeologists found something that shouldn't have survived that long. Food. Deliberately stored. Deliberately preserved. Someone figured out how to beat time itself with nothing but dirt, cold, and smoke. You think your fridge keeps you safe. It doesn't. It just keeps you lazy. Let's find out what our ancestors actually knew. Let's start with the obvious enemy. Rot isn't mysterious to us anymore. We know it's bacteria, mold, enzymes, tiny organisms breaking food down faster than we can eat it. Ancient humans didn't know any of that. No microscopes, no germ theory, nothing. What they had was pattern recognition running over hundreds of thousands of years. Meat left in the sun goes bad. Meat left in the cold doesn't. Meat near smoke lasts longer. Meat packed in salt lasts longer still. They didn't need to know why. They only needed to know it worked. And once something worked, it got repeated, refined, and taught. Fire again. It always comes back to fire. Smoking meat is one of the oldest preservation technologies we have evidence for, and it's not an accident that it shows up almost everywhere humans do. Smoke does two things at once. It dries the meat out, pulling moisture away so bacteria have nothing to grow in, and it coats the surface in compounds that are naturally antimicrobial. Ancient humans weren't chasing chemistry. They were chasing flavor and convenience, and the chemistry came along for free. Hang strips of meat over a low fire for a few days, and you've converted something that would rot in 48 hours into something that survives for months. This wasn't a niche trick. It shows up in the archaeological and ethnographic record on every inhabited continent. Cold climates, hot climates, forests, deserts. Different meat, same fire, same principle. Drying without smoke worked too, especially in dry, sunny climates where the air itself could do the job. Thin strips of meat laid out in direct sun and wind lose water fast enough that spoilage organisms simply can't establish themselves before the meat is safe. This is jerky, essentially, and versions of it appear independently in nearly every arid and semi-arid environment humans settled. Indigenous peoples across the American Great Plains dried bison meat this way for generations, sometimes pounding it with dried berries and rendered fat into a dense, calorie-packed mixture that could last an entire winter without spoiling. That mixture had a name: pemmican. And it wasn't a snack. It was often the difference between a group surviving a bad season and not. Here's where it gets stranger, though. Because drying wasn't the only answer. Sometimes the answer was the opposite of drying: fermentation. Modern people hear fermented and think of something curated, artisanal, a cheese board. Ancient fermentation was messier and far more essential. Certain bacteria, given the right conditions, actually outcompete the harmful ones. They lower the pH of food. They produce compounds that make the environment hostile to the organisms that cause dangerous spoilage. And in the process, they often make the food more digestible and more nutritious than it started out. Ancient humans didn't understand any of that mechanism. What they understood was that meat or fish buried a certain way, left a certain length of time, came out safe to eat, and lasted far longer than fresh. Some Arctic and subarctic peoples developed fermented fish and meat preparations that modern outsiders often find genuinely alarming. Buried, weighted down, left for weeks or months, deliberately allowed to break down under controlled conditions. It sounds like recklessness. It's actually precision. Get the conditions wrong, and it's genuinely dangerous. Get them right, refined over countless generations of trial, error, and death, and it's a stable, long-lasting food source in an environment where almost nothing grows for most of the year. Every fermented food you've ever eaten, cheese, yogurt, sourdough, pickles, is a domesticated, sanitized descendant of exactly this kind of ancient survival technology. Now let's go back to that hole in Siberia, because it deserves the full explanation. Cold storage is one of the oldest and most intuitive preservation methods humans ever discovered, because in the right climates, the environment was already doing most of the work. Dig a pit deep enough, and you hit ground that stays consistently cold, sometimes permanently frozen, year-round. Drop meat into that pit, cover it, and you've built a freezer with no moving parts and no electricity bill. Archaeological sites across Siberia and northern Europe show deliberate storage pits dug specifically for this purpose, some associated with settlements that clearly relied on them seasonally, stockpiling meat during successful hunts to survive the long stretches when hunting failed. In genuinely frozen ground, permafrost, meat could be preserved for astonishingly long periods, essentially flash frozen the same way a modern freezer works, just using the planet instead of a compressor. Even in less extreme climates, humans figured out microclimate exploitation with remarkable precision. Underground root cellars stayed cooler and more stable than surface temperature. Shaded, elevated storage kept food away from ground moisture and scavenging animals. Streams and cold springs were used to submerge food in constantly circulating cold water, an ancient refrigerator running on nothing but topography and gravity. None of this required understanding thermodynamics. It required paying close attention to which spots in the landscape kept things cold, and remembering them, and returning to them, generation after generation. Then there's fat, which almost nobody thinks of as a preservation tool, but functionally, it's one of the best. Rendered animal fat, poured hot over meat and allowed to cool and solidify, creates a physical seal that keeps oxygen and airborne bacteria away from the food underneath. This is essentially the ancient version of a vacuum seal, and it shows up specifically in cold climate cultures with regular access to large game. Meat packed into fat, stored in cool conditions, could last through an entire winter, protected by a barrier that required no tools to make beyond a fire and a container. It's the same basic principle behind confit, a French cooking technique people treat today as fine dining, that started as a way to make a slaughtered animal survive the months until spring. Salt deserves its own mention, because in the places where it was available, it may be the single most powerful preservation tool ancient humans ever had access to. Salt draws water out of food through osmosis, and without water, spoilage organisms simply can't function. Coastal and inland salt-producing regions developed salting and brining techniques that could preserve meat and fish for remarkably long stretches, sometimes over a year. Salt wasn't just a seasoning in the ancient world. In many economies, it was closer to currency, valuable enough to fight wars over, precisely because it meant the difference between a hungry winter and a survivable one. But here's the part of this story that almost never gets told, and it might be the most important piece of all. None of these techniques mattered without the social structure to use them properly. A single hunter with a mammoth carcass and no group has a problem. Too much food, too little time, and no way to process it all before it spoils. A group with shared labor, shared knowledge, and shared storage has an opportunity. Preservation wasn't just a technical skill. It was a coordination problem solved by people working together, at scale, under time pressure, with the entire group's survival on the line. Someone had to know which cuts smoked well and which needed salt. Someone had to know where the cold pits were dug and how deep. Someone had to know how long fermentation needed to run before it was safe rather than dangerous. This knowledge didn't live in books. It lived in specific people, usually older, more experienced members of the group, and it was passed down through direct teaching, through watching, through getting it wrong under supervision instead of getting it wrong alone. Losing that knowledge was not a minor inconvenience. A group that lost its most experienced food preservers could genuinely starve the following winter, even with plenty of successful hunts, simply because nobody left knew how to make the meat last. Preservation knowledge was survival infrastructure in exactly the same way fire carrying and shelter building were. It just gets talked about far less. Because rot doesn't leave dramatic ruins behind. It leaves nothing at all. So when you actually add it up, ancient humans weren't improvising against rot. They were running an entire preservation system, layered and redundant. Smoke for meat that needed to travel. Drying for meat in dry climates with strong sun. Fermentation for fish and meat in places where almost nothing else worked. Cold pits and permafrost where the ground itself could do the job. Fat seals for winter storage. Salt where it was available, treated like treasure because, functionally, it was. And underneath all of it, a social system built specifically to protect and transmit the knowledge of how to do each of these things correctly. Because getting it wrong didn't just waste food, it killed people. You have a machine humming quietly in your kitchen right now that does, instantly and automatically, what took your ancestors thousands of years of trial, death, and refinement to figure out. You open a door, and cold air keeps everything inside from doing what food naturally wants to do, which is fall apart. You don't think about it. You've never had to bury a mammoth leg in a frozen pit and pray you remembered the right spot. You've never